Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're really excited to have you all here. I know it's a busy time of year, so thank you for taking the time to join us. Today, we're going to be presenting on the role of the regulatory importer. My name is Megan. I'll be moderating today, and Edgar Kasteel, our CEO and founder of MedEnvoy Global, will be the main presenter. To start, we will be going through the presentation. At the end, we'll have a Q&A session. We'll be starting with questions that were submitted in advance. And if any questions come up throughout, feel free to drop those in the question box area in the top right corner, and we'll address as many as we can. If we don't get to your question, we'll follow up with email so you still get an answer. But please welcome me in joining Edgar Kasteel.
Thank you, Megan. Yep. Welcome everybody. I understand that we have people from all over the world, so it's a pleasure and my honor to address you today. And I would like to wish people good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, and welcome to this webinar. Before we jump into the content of the presentation, I'd like to give you a bit of a background on myself and the company that we work for. So, as said, my name is Edgar Kasteel. I joined Emergo, a well-established regulatory affairs company, in 2005, and was active not in the field of regulatory, but in distribution consulting. And in 2017, Emergo got acquired by UL, and the focus for UL was to be on regulatory only. So the distribution consulting part was no longer of interest. So I went my own way, and that was about the time that the MDR and the IVDR became serious business. And with my background in distribution, especially the role of importer caught my eye and really intrigued me. And I started looking at, can we provide a role as an importer that is not the traditional importer, so not the importer that buys and sells goods, but is the importer according to the law, without touching devices, without becoming owner of the devices. And this looked all very, very interesting and very good, but I also realized early on that I couldn't do it all by myself. So I checked in with Renee, the founder of Emergo and the former owner of Emergo, if he wanted to join me in this interesting path, and he did, and we started working on this, and in September 2020, we finalized the company and established MedEnvoy Global in the Netherlands. And from there on, it went really, really quick. So we had some fortunate events for us, not always fortunate for the people involved, but we had Brexit end of December, we had Swixit in May 2021. That meant that suddenly in those territories, also the role of the regulatory importer became important. So that led to a huge increase for us in the number of customers. So in 2021 when we started, we had three customers, and in 2021 we already had 300, and in 2022 800, and now we're around 1,000 customers with whom we work on a daily basis. But as I said, we cannot do it all by myself. So early on, the team was added with Renee, but also we knew that we had to look at the processes, and this is where Stefan Tuschen came in. Stefan, with his background as a managing partner at the Boston Consulting Group, focusing on the processes. But even with the three of us, we realized we cannot do this alone. So in May 2021 was when we had our first employee join the company. And from that moment on, we grew in a rapid pace. And today we have almost 60 people in our team, with the two main offices here where I am in the Netherlands, in The Hague, and our team in the US is in Austin, Texas. So quickly, what is it we do? As said, we started as a regulatory importer for the EU, Switzerland and the UK, but quickly added on also in-country representation services. So we can also act as the EU AR, the EC rep, the UK RP, and the Swiss rep. And with that came the need for regulatory and quality affairs consulting. So we also added our own folks, our own regulatory experts to the team. And more recently, we are have developed services in the field of post-market surveillance, international registrations, and UDMED registration management. And we're keep adding services, and not only, let's say, in the type of business that we do, but also in the areas where we do it. Because we know that the customers that we work with more are, let's say, small to medium-sized small to medium-sized companies, and they want to go global. And with that, you need global expertise on what's happening in those different markets, what are the regulatory requirements for the different markets. So we know that companies would really like to have that single point of entry where they can come back with all their questions on the regulations and what it takes to get devices registered. So currently we have a setup with our own offices in the EU, in the UK, in Switzerland. We have our offices in New Zealand, in Australia, in the US and Mexico. But we also work with partners, and that's why we do it in Israel, in India, in Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. In all these territories, we can offer our services. So this is for the commercial part. Let's go deeper into the role of the importer of the EU, because that's what you tune in for. And the presentation that I created was made for the role of the EU importer, but the same principle applies for the UK importer and the Swiss importer. Although for the UK, the regulations are not that strictly, I'll say, clearly defined as they are for the EU and for Switzerland, but we do know that also the UK is looking at the MDR and the roles of the economic operators that are out there. So we kind of say, take it that what we do in Europe and Switzerland also applies in the UK as it comes to the role of import. As I mentioned before, MDD did not recognize the role of importer. It was not defined as one of the economic operators. Under MDR, they are. So if you look at the MDR, you see that Article 2 defines the importer. It is an importer means any natural or legal person established within the Union that places a device from a third country on the Union market. So that is, let's say, the definition, who can be an importer. So they have to be established in the EU. And the same goes for the Switzerland. It has to be established in Switzerland or in the UK, in the UK. And the obligations that apply to the regulatory importer are defined in Article 13 of the MDR. But before we go deeper into that, there's a lot of confusion because importations have happened even before the MDR came into effect. People were importing devices. So when the MDR defined and made very explicit what are the obligations of the importer, a lot of confusion started because who can be the importer? Who is the importer? So to nail down, let's say, that definition, we always look at importers from three different angles. So there's the physical element, shipments from outside the EU to a distributor, a hospital, or an end user in the EU, the physical part. Be it by air, by sea, or by truck, because you have to be physically transported. A very confusing one sometimes is the fiscal one, because the moment that there are importations, customs duties and VAT have to be handled. This is something that a lot of companies are also not aware of, because the fact that you have to deal with this, have to arrange it, make sure that you do it right. And then there's the new kid on the block, the regulatory importer, as we call it, who focuses on creating the legal access to the union market. And these three flows can be organized independently of each other. Of course, they are interlinked, but let's say you can have somebody that only takes care of the physical part, could be a freight forwarder. You can have somebody that only takes care of your fiscal part. It's fiscal representatives. Those are companies that specialize in dealing with customs and VAT reporting. And you can have a company that specializes fully on being that regulatory importer only, that only focuses on being that importer dealing with the obligations under Article 13 of the MDR. This is what we do. So as said, we don't touch devices, so we are not involved in the physical part of the importations. The fiscal part, we just purely focus on the regulatory side of importations. Important to understand is that an importer is needed for each and every importation into the EU. So now let's see, because the confusion arrives not out of nowhere, but there's a lot of entities that can become importer, can work as importer. So first of all, if a legal manufacturer, a manufacturer has an EU-based legal entity, that entity can be appointed or can work as the importer. Just like a lot of non-EU manufacturers have, for instance, a European headquarters for sales and marketing purposes, but a lot of times also that entity is working as the EU rep. But we also see a lot of manufacturers that have their European-based legal entity operate as the importer. It's very common. We also see that sometimes European authorized representatives take on the role of importer. Not that many, but there are a few companies that take on that role. Distributors. This, of course, is let's say the most common example of importer, because also in the past, distributors typically when they work with manufacturers, they buy their goods X works, so they make sure that they pick up the goods from the manufacturing side, for instance, in the US, take care of the transportation, customs clearance, and do the importations from that angle into the EU. They've been doing this for many years, but now they're then also acting as an importer. Interesting part is that if you look at the definition of a distributor, then it actually says that the distributor is an entity that is not the manufacturer and not the importer, which creates an interesting dilemma, because if you are the importer, can you be the distributor? According to the legislation and the definitions, technically not. But this is also then what we see. This is, let's say, in practice, a lot of distributors are acting as importers. Then we have 3PLs, third-party logistics service providers. These are companies that are pretty much involved in supply chain. So they have a warehouse where bulk shipments come in, pick and pack takes place, and then smaller deliveries take place within the European continent. A lot of companies have this set up, and if these third parties would, let's say, perform the activities of a regulatory importer, they could then also qualify as the importer. We know quite a few of these 3PLs, and we also know that they don't want to be the regulatory importer because they don't like the liability that comes with it, but also they don't always have the regulatory expertise that comes with the role of importer. And then last but not least is the independent importers, as we call them. So these are entities that are purely focusing on the role of importer. And as I said, the way we do it, we are purely focusing on the regulatory side of the importations, not getting involved in the commercial side. So we don't buy, we don't sell goods, we purely focus on the shipments that come into Europe and make sure that they are compliant. What's very important to understand is that an importer qualifies. So if a distributor would receive a shipment from a manufacturer out of the US, and in that shipment it's clear that there's no importer identified for that shipment, then the distributor that receives that shipment automatically becomes the importer. And with that, automatically has to meet the obligations under Article 13 of the MDR. And that's where sometimes the problem arises, because sometimes distributors don't even realize that they are the importer, but they are. And it's very important to understand this, because the reason for having this makes the MDR pretty unique, because that means that each and every shipment, even without knowing of the manufacturer that enters the European market, has to be registered. So if, for instance, a US manufacturer sells their devices to a distributor in Brazil, and then the distributor in Brazil sells it to a distributor in Germany without the manufacturer knowing it in the US, that shipment from Brazil to Europe, there will be an importer for that. And when there is an importer, the importer has to register themselves, link themselves to the manufacturer in UDAMED. So in UDAMED, the manufacturer can suddenly see, hey, wait a minute, there is a shipment. There was an importer for shipments that I'm not aware of. And so for manufacturers, it's good to see that they have all the importations. They should be visible in UDMED. So in UDMED, it lists all the importers that have imported devices for a manufacturer. Pretty interesting, because but it also means that the parallel imports now suddenly are visible. Under the MDD, there was no way to track it, and that is, I think, the ultimate idea of the MDR. Yes, and to make Europe safe with better devices, but also the traceability part is very, very important, and the importer plays an important role in that part. Okay, let's look a bit deeper into the different roles of the different economic operators that we have. As said, we have, if you look at the distribution chain, you have the manufacturer that has a device. Device needs to have an EC rep if there's a manufacturer from outside Europe. You have an importer, you have a distributor, and then ultimately the devices will be put into service at the point of use. So let's look at the definitions that we have for the different economic operators. So the importer is any natural or legal person established within the union that places a device from a third country on the union market. Article 233. Placing on the market is it first making available of a device other than investigational devices on the union market. And that's where the difference comes in. It's the first making available of a device. The distributor, as I already mentioned, is any natural or legal person in the supply chain, other than the manufacturer or the importer, that makes the device available on the market, up until the point of putting it into service. And the making available is any supply of a device other than the investigational device for distribution, consumption, or use in the union market in the course of a commercial activity, whether in return for payment or free of charge. And we do get a lot of questions. I'm sending a sample for a trade show. I'm sending samples over for a surgeon to look into. Also, these shipments, they require an importer. And ultimately, in the point of use, you have basically two endpoints. You have the health institution and you have the users. And that could be a professional user, but also a lay person. So these are, let's say, the different operators in the distribution chain, with all having their own responsibilities. And but then you can still have different scenarios. So let's look at a couple of scenarios that we see on a regular basis. So one of the scenarios is distance sales. This is a situation where a legal manufacturer sends directly devices to an end user. In those cases, there is not it's not placing on the market. It's straight away making available. So that means that there is no importer required. This is interesting because you would think it would be good to have an importer, and that's also what we see. In the concept of distance sales, although there is no requirement to have an importer, from different angles, liability, it could be advisable that a manufacturer works with an importer to make sure that the bases are covered and liability is well arranged. What you do need is that even if there is no importer, for sure there is a need for an EC rep. So if you place devices from outside the EU, the EC rep is always needed. In scenario 2 is where you also have the EC rep, but you have that importer. There is this importer in place that then ships onwards to the end users. The third scenario is where you then have the whole chain with importer and distributor, and then the end users. So as I already mentioned, that let's say with the coming into service of the MDR and the IVDR, all these economic operators have their obligations, and the goal is that verification and traceability of medical devices is well arranged. So it should not be possible that devices are placed on the market without anybody knowing it. What's also very good is that UDMED, although the timelines are still long, and let's say a couple of modules are still not implemented yet, Ultimately, EUDAMED will be the key where you can have the traceability of these devices on the market. So in EUDAMED, you can actually see who are importers linked to a legal manufacturer, what are the devices placed on the European market, and also, let's say, which notified bodies, which certificates are involved. So ultimately, EUDAMED will be that visibility on the market in the EU. And in Switzerland, they will have SwissDemed, an equivalent of EUDAMED, with exactly the same principles. So now let's look at the different obligation when it comes to verification, because we say it's verification and traceability. So how does that work in real practice? So when you look at the different roles and you look at what is the responsibility of the EC rep in verification, is that the moment that somebody mandates an EC rep, as that an importer qualifies, but an EC rep has to be mandated. That means that the EC rep will review technical documentation and will check if the appropriate conformity assessment procedures have been followed. We'll also check if there is a valid declaration of conformity, a valid CE certificate. And with that, there is CE marking on the device. The manufacturer has been identified, the EC rep has been designated, the labeling is correct, the IFU holds meets the standards, the IFU is in the correct language, UDIs have been assigned, and the device is listed in EUDAMED. These are things that an EC rep typically verifies. And here comes the principle of the distribution chain and verification throughout the process. So the importer has to also verify. They have to verify the DOC, the CE certificate is applicable, if there's CE marking, if the manufacturer is identified, if the EC rep is identified. The importer has to be identified. That's an obligation of the importer itself. Check also if there's correct labeling, UDI and EUDAMED. Same checks. And then when you look at the distributor, you see that the number of verifications already are dropping down, but there's always the combination. You'll always have the situation that 2 verifications have been done in the distribution chain. And so a distributor needs to identify, again, DOC, CE marking, is there an importer, is the IFU in the correct language, and is there a UDI assigned. So with that, the EU, with the setup, has created a situation that verification of compliant devices is done throughout the distribution chain. For purposes of traceability, identification is very important. So all the economic operators, let's say 2 of the economic operators have to be identified very clearly. So the EC rep has to be on the label, and the importer label, packaging, or document accompanying device. And so these are the options that are available in certain situations. The distributor doesn't have to be identified on the labeling. So they can, and most likely for commercial reasons they will, but in, let's say, there's no requirement that the distributor is identified on the device. When it comes to EUDAMED, the EC rep and the importer have to be in EUDAMED. And the EC rep, being mandated by the manufacturer, will go through a process where the manufacturer acknowledges that the EC rep is indeed the EC rep that was mandated. The importer has to do an active role. The importer has to link itself to a manufacturer. So coming back to the parallel imports, even if there's no agreement between a manufacturer and an importer, if the importer receives a device from a manufacturer and they are the importer for that specific shipment, they have to then go into EUDAMED and say, I am an importer for this legal manufacturer. And I said, the other way around, legal manufacturer in that way gets a pretty nice overview of who has been importing their devices into the EU. As I said, there's also for, let's say, the distributor, there is no registration of distributors in EUDAMED. Okay, let's go deeper into the role of the importer, the obligations. So already identified, the very important part of the importer is to verify that there are devices are in compliance. Also very important is that the importer has to check if transport and storage conditions have been met. So if there's a device that has temperature control, the importer has to verify that those conditions have been met. And if not, then there's, let's say, there is non-compliant. So there's a non-conforming device. So then there has to be something happening. Verification, identification, the tracking of shipments is a very important role of the importer. So each and every shipment that goes through an importer has to be recorded, put into the systems. So if needed, can be asked later on in the process. This happens with each and every importation into the Union. And then there's activities that are obligations that are more event-based. So the moment that an importer receives a complaint on a device or is involved in recalls, they have to maintain records of that. If there is, the moment that an importer receives a complaint, they have to make sure that these are forwarded to the manufacturer and in some cases also the authorized representative. Very important, the moment that a national competent authority is involved and they come to the importer has to work with the NCA in providing samples and granting access to the device. And so these are things that the importer has to do. So this is not optional. This is an obligation of the importer. And that's also sometimes what we see with our customers. Do you need to do this? Yes. And this is a role by law that we need to execute if needed. It goes a bit further in terms of the obligation. So as said, only places the importer only places devices on the market that are compliant with the MDR or the IVDR. And the importer has to be registered as their own economic operator with their own unique registration number. But also, we have to keep as an importer a copy of the Declaration of Conformity or CE certificates for at least 10 years. And for implants, it's even 15 years. And there's also a topic that sometimes is not well understood. But the moment that a device is not in conformity, we have to inform the manufacturer and the EAR, which is understood. But if we think that the device is presenting a serious risk or there's, let's say, falsifications, we need not only to inform the manufacturer and AR, but also the competent authority. In our case, would be ITJ in the Netherlands. So this is also not something that we want to do, no, we need to do. And it goes even further. If we feel that there is a serious risk, also then, but as I say, even if devices have been placed on the market and we feel that there was a serious risk, we also need to inform the parties like the manufacturer, the AR, the NCAs, and even the notified bodies. So this is, let's say, a couple of very stringent obligations. So it's not a role to take lightly, because if we have to go to an NCA, yeah, of course, a manufacturer might be saying, yeah, why do you do that? Because it's our obligation. We are, by law, we need to do this. There's no other way. So far, obligations. And I want to drill down a bit more on labeling, because we say that identification is very important. And also, let's say, want to then go into, let's say, the other territories that we have. So first start with the MDR. So the importer has to be identified on the device, its packaging or document accompanying device. And in the EU, if let's say the importer is mentioned on the document accompanying device, in the EU, that document has to reach the end user. And so just a shipping note that stops at the distributor is not good enough. That document accompanying device has to go all the way to the end user. That's different in Switzerland, for instance. The responsibility of identifying the importer is a responsibility of the importer itself. So when a distributor is an importer, they can put on a sticker on the device, on the packaging, that identifies them as the importer. But, for instance, as you know, we are not touching devices, so we don't see these devices, so we cannot slap on a sticker on a package or a device. So we can subcontract the identification of the importer role. So we then ask our customers, our manufacturers, please identify us somewhere as the regulatory importer. What's very important, before placing the device on the market, so when a distributor sells on the goods, that's the moment that the devices have to be labeled with the importer. Specific topic for legacy devices, this is, let's say, at the discretion of the manufacturer. It's very much advisable because even if the devices are legacy devices, there is still the importer requirement. You still need that importer identified. But let's say according to the MDCG, it's at the discretion of the manufacturer. But it's strongly advised to do it. In Switzerland, we see that the also there, like in Europe, the identification of the import is on the device, the packaging, or a document accompanying the device. And in the UK, it's at the discretion again of the manufacturer. So even if devices have CE marking, and CE marking can be leveraged in the UK, but also UK CE marked devices don't require the identification of an importer. It's at the discretion of the manufacturer to do it. We have customers that do like to make us visible as the UK importer on their devices. So far, the theory, so far the regulations, so far the requirements. And I mentioned when we started with the role of this independent importer, a lot of confusion. We received so many questions from distributors, from manufacturers on how this now all works. So we're now some years down the road. We're on this path, and how is it now working? What is now the practice of the importer in Europe? So let's see what we can learn. So Swissmedic last year inspected 30 importers. We were not one of them, but they inspected 30 importers and they found some deficiencies. So for instance, when it comes to product verification, 18 out of the 30 importers had incomplete product checks, 60%. 8 out of the 30 had incomplete importer information. So the importer identification was not correct. 8 out of 30 also had inadequate storage and transport conditions. And this does not always apply to companies, but when it applies, again, an obligation of the importer to make sure that they check if the storage and transport conditions have been met. Complaint handling, 3 out of the 30 importers had deficiencies in recording and forwarding the complaints. And so competent authorities do check importers and check what is your procedure in dealing with complaints. So this shows that although a lot of things have happened, there's still work to do. And we also see that when we look at what we see from our customers, when they get audited by their notified body or when they have issues with the competent authority. So what we sometimes see is that declarations of conformity have been signed after the date of application of the MDR, which is not good. It shouldn't be the case. Mandatory data elements are missing. So audit reports show when we look at the shipment data, the UDI, for instance, is missing. Whenever manufacturers have quality agreements with the distributors, they sometimes don't reference the obligation of the importer. So the moment that an importer is acting, a distributor is acting as an importer, in a quality agreement, the manufacturer should make sure that the obligation of the importers have been taken into account by the distributor/importer. And we also see that there were findings that by notified bodies that said when looking at the devices, we see that not all the importers or no importers were listed in EUDAMET, and that then indicates that that part of the obligation of the importer have not been met. Because the manufacturer has been shipping devices, there should be importers listed in EUDAMET. That said, we focus purely on the role of being a regulatory importer, but let's say we know that there are challenges. If you are a distributor and you are acting as importer, are you aware of your obligations? Do you know what it means to let's say meet the obligations of the importer? So we see that, and we hear that sometimes importers in the field they deal with this. They face challenges. So keeping up with the regulations and especially guidances in the changes in regulations, I wouldn't say it's a daytime job, but you have to be on top of it. And especially in the role of importer, we see that because there's so much uncertainty and so much unclear. That's why you have to say, okay, what changed, and then you have to let's say act accordingly. It also means that Unimed, Swissdomed, it's all coming alive. But when? What does it mean for me? How do I have to act? Those are also things that provide challenges for those importers. And post-market surveillance, it's a responsibility, it's an obligation, but also here we see that it sometimes provides huge challenges for importers to deal with that. With this, I hope that I have given you some food for thought, some insights in the wonderful world of the regulatory importers. And yeah, let's see if you have any questions for me and the team. And I have, let's say, on standby our Director of Regulatory Affairs, Danielle Slegers. And so the moment that there are questions asked that are way beyond my pay grade, I can result and fall back on my colleague Danielle. Megan, back to you.
Thanks, Edgar. So we did have some questions that were pre-submitted. So we'll start with some of those. So first question we had was, what is the main difference between distributors and importers?
Yeah, as said, they have distinct roles. So important, an authorized representative gets mandated, an importer qualifies. And I hope that I showed that sometimes the responsibilities are overlapping, but they do have their specific roles. In the, let's say, I will say that the AR is more a gatekeeper. So they make sure that they check that the devices are in conformity before devices are placed on the market. So the moment that an AR takes its role serious and says, okay, I want to be mandated for this manufacturer for these devices, they want to make sure that these devices are compliant. And so a lot of the compliance check and for instance conformity assessments is done by the AR. So the scrutinization of the compliance side goes further than that of an importer. Having said that, and the AR is also responsible for the whole lifetime of the mandate of the AR for all the devices that are placed and have been placed on the market for that manufacturer. And the importer has that role to check each and every importation. So the role of the importer kicks in the moment that there are importations. So that's a main difference in how I see the roles of the two. So the EAR gatekeeper and responsible throughout the lifetime of the mandate, whereas the importer responsible for each and every shipment and a different level of verification, but verification to make sure that everything is in sync. So a moment that we, for instance, see that a shipment comes in and we receive the shipment data and we see that the CE certificate is expired, on that moment we say, okay, wait a minute, you cannot place this device on the market because that device has an expired CE certificate and that's not possible. And that's something that the AR might not see because they are not involved in that day-to-day activity of that manufacturer and their devices.
Next question we got in advance and then also a couple times in the chat from the live audience was, is it true that an importer and distributors cannot be the same entity?
Now this is according to the MDR, if you look at the definitions of the distributor, that says that any person not being the manufacturer or the importer, that would imply that the distributor cannot be the importer. What it could mean in real life is that if you have the distribution chain where the first entry of a shipment is with a distributor that is then becoming the actor, the importer, then sells on to a reseller, then you could say, okay, the first distributor is the importer, and the second, the reseller, then becomes the distributor. We sometimes also say that if you have that in one company, you would need to have the Chinese walls, but you have to make sure that you can show that you meet both the obligations, because the differences are the importer has different obligations than the distributor. So you have to be very clear, okay, which of the obligations you're meeting.
If the manufacturer is based within the European Union, is it essential to update the contract with distributors to clearly define the obligations of both parties?
Absolutely, yeah. So I think that is the contracts need to make sure, and as also mentioned, quality agreements are very important and very powerful tools to make sure that everybody is aware and lives up to the obligations that each and every entity has to perform. Yes.
Next question, can you address the concerns about data privacy and why using an independent importer might be more beneficial versus relying on a distributor in an importer role?
Yeah, but at the moment that let's say in the case that you work with an importer distributor, you do share a lot of information with that distributor. There's also IP sensitive information, you could argue, and in those cases, distributors do have a different role and also have a different goal in life. A distributor is a trading company, and they want to buy and sell devices, and that's their core business. And an importer like we, I wouldn't want to say that we don't care, but ultimately for us, we focus on the compliance side of the trade, and not so much the commercial side. So we have no interest in that sense to dig deeper in IP and maybe look for different vendors with different devices. So in that sense, you could argue that if you work with an importer, your sensitive information is better kept and more independently than if you would work with a distributor. And if you would look at the UDAMET, in the moment that you look into UDAMET with a legal manufacturer and see all the importers, i.e. distributors that act as importers, then that shows your complete distribution channel. And so sometimes it can be beneficial to say, you know what, if you have only one independent importer, you shield off your distribution network for the public eye. And then because the distributors don't need to be in or cannot even be in UDAMET unless that distributor also acts as importer.
Right. Okay, next question. How do the responsibilities of regulatory importers under MDR differ from similar roles in other global frameworks such as TGA, FDA? What unique considerations should manufacturers keep in mind when entering these markets?
Yeah, so that and in the US, you have the initial importer, and that is a different role than you have here in Europe. TGA also has a view that is very similar to what we see in Europe. In India, the role goes way further. So there also the importer is involved in the actual has to be involved in the actual customs clearance and giving the goods free for circulation in India. So you do see that there are differences, let's say from a compliance perspective, it's very good to say to look into that to say what makes it different in the different territories. And so, for instance, we purely focus on the role of the EU importer. We work with our partners in India, but so far, for instance, we have not looked into the role of the initial importer in the US because also there the liability part is a way different one than we have here. Not saying that we have that liability part here in the EU, Switzerland, and the UK, but the liability part is totally different in the US.
Next question, what role does UDAMED play in simplifying the tasks of importers, and why should manufacturers consider using UDAMED even before it becomes mandatory?
Yeah, it's, as said, the UDAMED consists of different modules, and ultimately, UDAMED will play a pivotal role in information exchange, and we do see that companies tend to wait. And I say, you know what, it's not mandatory yet, so let's wait and not do it now. But we say ultimately the visibility, vigilance, everything will be in UDAMED. So we kind of urge everybody to, if not done yet, do it as fast as possible, because before you know it, it's the modules are mandatory. And if you then are in, let's say something goes wrong and you miss the time slots, that could mean that you're not able to go into the market, and that will be so. That's why we say start as soon as possible, if not done already. And let's say ultimately,
Next.
the key part of UNIMED is to provide that traceability. Yeah? Every device that's placed on the market is visible in UNIMED, and that will lead to the visibility that is key in the thought of providing a safe, providing the end users with safe devices in the European market.
What innovations do you see emerge to support importers in handling increasing compliance demands such as PMS, risk management, risk assessments?
Yeah, so you cannot have a presentation without AI, for sure. Now, let's say if we see what needs to be done on importer side, and let's say gathering information, documents, and all that, and if you have manufacturers with lots of devices, lots of IFUs, DUC, CE certificates, and all, using AI to help screen those documents, of course, is going to be very, very powerful. And at the moment that you can work with these tools, also, let's say everything you put in the system by hand creates room for error, typing errors and all that. So AI can for sure help make that work easier. Comes with an investment, because still it's not very, very easy, but we do see that more and more tools get out there. We also are heavily investing ourselves in tools that we can make sure that we can do the work in a good way and with a high data quality.
Great. And how do you see the evolving, ever-changing EU regulatory landscape impacting the responsibilities of regulatory importers in the future?
Well, we we do expect that more and more entities will see that the role of importer is a good role to play, but people will also realize that you need to be very good in what you're doing. You have to be very serious, because we see. I showed the example of what's happening in Switzerland. Switzerland is actively inspecting economic operators, including imports. We do expect the same to happen in Europe. So in that sense, I think that the focus on working with the different economic operators in the distribution chain will be increasingly stringent, and the demands will be higher. So ultimately, making sure that patient safety is secured, and so in that sense, everything that has been laid down in UDAMED will be facilitating that process. And also, as I said, we were one of the first to become an independent importer. We do expect that more and more companies will see and will jump on that wagon and perform that role. And so we're not the only ones anymore, but still, we see that more, still way more companies work with distributors. than, for instance, with independent imports. But we do feel that that might change over time, because also distributors will see that, and we see that happening these days already. The liability that comes with the role of importer is a heavy one, is a different one than from being a distributor. And that's where it's also sometimes distributors say, happy to be a distributor, but I don't want to be your importer. And that is then making that split in those roles. As I said, can you be an importer and distributor at the same time? That makes that split and also become more natural, that you then look for somebody else who will take on that role as the importer.
Is there a transfer of any other rights?
Now that's a very interesting question. Because what we have seen is that we are harmonized in the EU. That means that the MDR applies to all member states in the EU, but you see that there's no language that trumps the other. And what we have seen in the European Blue Guide, that's where the whole the roles of, let's say, for instance, imports are also clearly defined but then not only for medical devices but for all industries. In the Blue Guide, there is a definition on the transfer of rights. We get questions a lot of times: can you be an importer indeed without touching those devices, without becoming owner? And the transfer of rights is a very important one. There is a discrepancy that in some languages it says yes, in others it said no, but there's no, as I said, there's no language that trumps the other. But we've had many discussions with legal counsel, and the intent, and that's what we always look for. The intent is to make sure that everybody understands his role, and that all the obligations have been met. And in certain supply chains, automotive, high tech, aviation, in these supply chains, the way we operate is known for many years. They've been doing this all along. Even larger medtech players, they also have what we call tax effective supply chains. They are organized this way that all the economic operators that are in the distribution chain are well defined. There are very clear boundaries. There are very clear moments that the obligation goes from one to the other. And that's been done for many years, and we don't expect that the medical device world will be then the exception, where with that clause that the importer has to take title, that tax effective supply chain suddenly becomes impossible. And so, but we also understand that this is an ongoing discussion, and a discussion that will be held in Brussels with the European Commission, and that motions have been put in place, and also to make sure that this unclarity becomes clear, because ultimately that is what is beneficial to all of us.
Great. One final question, just taking a look at the remaining time. How does this work for platforms like Amazon?
Yeah, that's also an interesting one, because if you talk about Amazon as a platform where you buy medical devices, and you can, how is then the role of an Amazon perceived? Are they then a distributor? Are they importer? It also ties down to where is the online shop based? Is the shop based in the EU, or is it outside the EU? That is also a factor that determines how this works. What we say now is that the moment that a platform is outside the EU and sells devices, for instance, directly to end consumers, that there is no requirement for an importer. Having said that, from different other angles, from a liability perspective, it is advised to have an importer. But in all cases, even if you buy a device from Amazon, Alibaba, then one thing that has to be established is that there is an authorized representative. And that's what we see sometimes happening, that when you buy devices online from outside the EU, they get shipped into the EU, and there's no authorized representative identified, and there's also no importer. That is, I say, for sure not compliant, and that's what we see that customs officials also get more and more savvy. We do see that devices get stopped at the border, and in those cases, then the question is who is taking care that the devices that are being sold by those platforms are going through the same kind of scrutiny that you have with verification and transparency that you have with normal supply chain. So this is a very interesting discussion, and we are looking more into this right now because we want to make sure that the companies that are working through these platforms are also delivering safe devices to patients in the European Union, but also that they make sure that they are compliant themselves. So then that benefits both the users in the end users in Europe, but also the manufacturers that bring the devices to the European market. So, what I said, platforms fall under the category of distance sales, and with that, typically no requirement for an importer, but strongly advised to let's say work with an importer on a voluntary basis.
Great. We will end it there today, taking a look at the time. Thank you, everyone, for attending and your engagement in the chat. Danielle, our Director of Regulatory Affairs, was answering some of those questions, but if your question didn't get answered, we took down your name and email, so we'll get back to you on that. Following this webinar, we'll send out a recording of the webinar along with the slides and a link if you want to schedule a follow-up call and discuss your specific question. So thank you all for attending. Appreciate it. Great job, Edgar.
And wish everybody, I think we can start doing that right now. Wish everybody happy holidays for yourself and your loved ones, wherever you are, and a safe journey into 2025.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye.